Rain hammered the pavement like a relentless drumbeat as Emily Dawson sprinted across the intersection, clutching a tattered umbrella that did little to protect her. Every step splashed cold water up her legs, soaking her worn sneakers and numbing her toes. Around her, the city buzzed with indifference. People shoved past, taxis honked, neon signs blurred behind sheets of rain. Emily tightened her arms around a thin portfolio, her last lifeline. She needed this interview to work. She needed a miracle. Just as she reached the other side of the street, a frail old man struggled to lift himself from the curb, his cane slipping on the slick concrete. Without thinking, Emily darted toward him, shielding him with her broken umbrella. "Lean on me," she urged, her voice steady despite her shivering. The man hesitated, then grabbed her arm gratefully. Together, they stumbled to the awning of a nearby bookstore. "Thank you, dear," the man wheezed, catching his breath. Emily smiled weakly, her heart pounding harder from exertion than kindness. She brushed her soaked bangs from her eyes, whispered a rushed, "Take care," and darted off again. Her interview was 5 minutes away, and she was already late. Across the street, a tall figure in a charcoal coat watched the scene unfold with keen interest. James Carter had seen the world at its worst: greed, betrayal, selfishness in shiny suits and expensive shoes. Watching Emily shield a stranger without hesitation hit him in a place he thought long frozen. He watched her run through the rain, clutching a disintegrating folder against her chest, her umbrella flipping inside out. She disappeared into the urban mist, but the moment lingered in James's mind like a splinter he couldn't ignore. Inside the coffee shop, Emily squeezed water from the hem of her jacket and tried to compose herself. She checked the time. 15 minutes late. Her stomach twisted. The hostess glanced at her disdainfully as she entered. "Interviews are upstairs. 3rd door on the left," she said, voice clipped. Emily nodded, her cheeks burning from more than just the cold. She moved quickly, shoes squeaking embarrassingly against the polished floor. Halfway up the stairs, disaster struck. The bottom of her portfolio, soaked through, tore apart. Sketches rained down the steps, portraits, street scenes, her dreams captured in trembling pencil lines. Emily gasped, scrambling to gather them. People stepped over her, irritated at the inconvenience. No one helped. She was invisible again, like she had been ever since she lost everything. At the top of the stairs, James paused, holding a takeaway, coffee in one hand, briefcase in the other. He watched as Emily frantically collected her life off the floor. Without thinking, he bent down and picked up one of the sketches. His brows lifted in surprise. It was stunning, a gritty, heartbreakingly honest rendering of the city skyline, full of sorrow and stubborn hope. James straightened, clutching the sketch as if it were a relic. Emily noticed him standing there, frozen with her drawing in his hand. "That's mine," she said, breathlessly embarrassed. James offered a slow smile and extended the page toward her. Their fingers brushed. For a moment, everything, the rain, the noise, the judgmental stares, faded away. There was just her exhaustion, his intrigue, and the fragile line connecting them. "You're talented," James said simply, his voice low and sure. Emily blinked, caught off guard. No one had told her that in years, not since before the eviction, not since before the world had turned cold. She forced a laugh. "Doesn't pay much when you're living on sidewalks." She crammed the pages back into her ruined folder and hurried toward the interview door without looking back. James watched her disappear, something tugging sharply at his chest. He wasn't supposed to care. He didn't even know her. But something about the haunted determination in her eyes lodged itself inside him. He checked his watch. He was already late for a board meeting. Still, he hesitated. Something told him he hadn't seen the last of Emily Dawson. Inside the conference room, the interview was brutal. Emily sat across from a woman who barely looked up from her laptop. "Experience?" the woman asked. Emily rattled off her limited internships, omitting the months of living hand to mouth. portfolio?" the woman asked. Emily handed over the sodden remains of her dreams. The woman thumbed through it, grimacing at the water damage. "We're looking for candidates with a more polished presentation," the woman said flatly, sliding the portfolio back across the table like it was contaminated. Emily nodded stiffly, feeling the shame claw up her throat. "Thank you for your time," she whispered, standing before she could cry. She fled the room, fled the building, fled the disapproving stares that followed her like ghosts. Back outside, the rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle. Emily sank onto a bench, pulling her knees to her chest. She stared at the city lights through blurry eyes. Her dreams had been washed away, both figuratively and literally. She was down to her last few dollars. Tonight, it would be another sleepless night in the shelter, assuming they still had a bed. As she rocked herself for warmth, a soft click sounded nearby. She looked up to see James Carter standing in front of her, holding out a fresh cup of coffee. For a moment, she just stared at him, too numb to speak. Then, without a word, she reached out and took it. Their fingers brushed again, and something electric passed between them. A current of understanding, unseen but undeniable. James sat down on the opposite end of the bench, careful not to crowd her. They sipped their coffee in silence. Emily didn't ask why he was there. James didn't offer an explanation. The city roared around them, loud, cruel, indifferent. But on that battered bench under a broken umbrella, something rare and fragile had taken root. And neither of them knew yet just how much it would change their lives. The next morning, the world seemed determined to remind Emily of her insignificance. She trudged through narrow alleyways, dodging puddles and discarded dreams, her backpack clinking with the few coins she had left. As she wandered aimlessly, hunger gnawed at her belly like a relentless rat. She didn't want to go back to the shelter yet. She needed something to hope for, even if it was just a warm place to sit. Across the street, a neon sign flickered, Bean and Bloom Cafe. It looked too polished, too expensive, but Emily's body made the decision before her mind could argue. She pushed open the glass door, and a bell chimed overhead. Warmth engulfed her instantly, bringing the rich scent of coffee and fresh pastries. Her stomach growled audibly, causing her to blush and glance around nervously. The cafe was cozy but upscale. Wooden floors, hanging plants, walls lined with art. The kind of place that catered to people with MacBooks and leather satchels. Emily hugged herself tightly and shuffled toward the counter. The barista, a tall woman with sharp eyeliner, looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, already sounding tired of her. Emily pulled the last crumpled bills from her pocket. "Just a black coffee, please, small." She placed the money on the counter, willing herself not to shrink under the woman's gaze. The barista took it reluctantly, as though touching Emily's coins might infect her with failure. Behind her, the espresso machine hissed and spat like it was protesting the transaction too. As she waited, Emily spotted a quiet corner booth near the window and made a beeline for it, hoping to become invisible. She clutched her coffee cup like a lifeline, inhaling the steam. Across the room, James Carter sat with his own mug, a laptop open before him. He watched her discreetly over the rim of his cup, masking his interest behind practiced indifference. James wasn't supposed to be there. His office had a state-of-the-art espresso machine and a personal chef, but something had pulled him out. Into the city this morning. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe guilt, maybe the nagging feeling that he wasn't done with her story. Watching Emily sit alone, hunched and wary, something twisted painfully in his chest. His phone buzzed. His assistant probably wondering where he was. James silenced it without a glance. He leaned back in his seat, weighing his next move carefully. She was like a bird with broken wings. Any sudden movement might scare her off for good. No, he would wait, watch, understand. If he approached her wrong, he could lose the chance before it even began. Meanwhile, Emily pulled out her sketchbook, the one portfolio she managed to salvage. The pages were warped from yesterday's rain, but her drawings still bled hope across every line. She flipped through them slowly, her fingers trembling not from cold, but from fear. Fear that her art would never matter. Fear that she would vanish into the cracks of this ruthless city without anyone even noticing. She didn't notice James observing her. She didn't notice the two wealthy women nearby whispering about her torn jacket. All she saw were her dreams, soggy and crumbling in her lap. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away stubbornly. If the world wanted to break her, it would have to try harder. She hadn't come this far just to surrender. James set his laptop aside, unable to keep pretending he wasn't invested. He rose slowly, smoothing his jacket, and crossed the cafe toward her table. Each step felt heavier than it should. He wasn't just approaching a homeless artist. He was stepping into a story he didn't know how to finish, a story that could change everything if he had the courage to turn the first page. "Mind if I sit?" His voice was low, cautious. Emily's head snapped up, wide-eyed. She opened her mouth to say no, instinctively protective, but something about him, the softness behind his guarded eyes, made her hesitate. She nodded wordlessly. James slid into the booth opposite her, giving her space, giving her time. "I saw your work yesterday," James said carefully. "It's extraordinary." Emily gave a hollow laugh, closing the sketchbook roughly. "Tell that to the art directors who won't even look me in the eye." James tilted his head slightly. Sometimes the best work doesn't belong to the loudest voices. It belongs to the ones brave enough to keep creating, even when no one's watching. Emily studied him closely now. His suit was tailored, his watch expensive, but there was something unpolished about him too, a sadness tucked behind the charm. He wasn't another corporate shark, at least not entirely. "Why do you care?" she asked bluntly, wrapping her hands around the coffee cup again, like it might anchor her. James hesitated. The truth was complicated. He cared because she reminded him of a version of himself he'd buried long ago. The dreamer, the fighter. He cared because in a world full of polished fakes, Emily was painfully, beautifully real, but he couldn't say that. Not yet. Instead, he smiled slightly. "Maybe I just believe in lost causes." Her lips twitched into the ghost of a smile. "Well, you picked a good one." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was curious, cautious, alive. For the first time in months, Emily felt something other than fear coiling. In her gut, hope, a fragile thing but fierce when it chose to bloom. "Let me buy you lunch," James offered suddenly. Emily blinked, thrown. Her first instinct was to refuse, to mistrust kindness, but her stomach growled traitorously, answering for her. She pressed her lips together, then nodded once. James smiled, a real one this time, and stood to place the order. Emily watched him go, confusion swirling inside her. Maybe it was dangerous to trust a stranger, maybe it was reckless. But then again, what had caution ever earned her except more cold nights and closed doors? She sat back against the worn leather seat, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't explain. Outside, the rain began to fall again, softer this time, almost like a promise. Something was changing, something had already begun. Lunch arrived in a flurry of clinking plates and whispered stares from nearby tables. James placed a steaming bowl of tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich in front of Emily. Simple, unpretentious, but to her it felt like a feast. She murmured a shy, "Thank you," and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to savor the smell before digging in cautiously. James watched her with an expression that was difficult to name, part admiration, part curiosity, part something heavier. He didn't touch his own plate immediately. Instead, he leaned his elbows on the table, resting his chin lightly on his hands. Emily's cautious demeanor reminded him of a stray cat, desperate for food, but still prepared to bolt at any wrong move. Halfway through the sandwich, Emily finally spoke. "So what's your story? Guys like you don't usually buy lunch for people like me." She said it without bitterness, only weary honesty. James smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm not like most guys." Emily raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. James chuckled under his breath. "Or maybe I used to be closer to your world than you think." He wasn't lying. Before the Carter name was synonymous with power, it had been synonymous with struggle. His father clawed their way into fortune with bloodied hands and sleepless nights. James grew up watching ambition eat away at family dinners and replace lullabies with balance sheets. He knew how it felt to want something so badly your ribs ached, but he didn't say all that. Not yet. Instead, he offered, "Let's just say life has a way of humbling everyone eventually." Emily studied him for a moment, weighing his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe there were cracks in the glossy armor rich people wore, but believing was dangerous. It meant letting your guard down. After lunch, James offered to walk her somewhere safe. Emily almost refused out, of habit, but paused. The thought of stepping back into the wet greyness of the city alone tightened her chest. She nodded stiffly, zipping her jacket up to her chin. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, the wind nipped at their faces and tugged at Emily's tangled hair. They walked in silence for a few blocks, past boarded-up shops and graffiti murals screaming silent rage. James noticed how she instinctively kept to the edges, how her eyes flicked toward alleyways and moving cars like a soldier in enemy territory. He felt a protective surge rise in him, unfamiliar and fierce. At the corner of 12th and Vine, Emily stopped abruptly. "This is fine," she said, shoving her hands into her pockets. James frowned. "It's not safe here." She shrugged one shoulder. "Safe's a luxury." Her voice was a matter of fact, not self-pitying, and that somehow made it hurt even more. James hesitated, torn between respecting her independence and the gnawing instinct to help. "Will you be okay?" he asked finally. Emily smiled, a small, tired thing. "Been okay longer than most people would have lasted." James knew she was lying. She wasn't okay. She was surviving. There was a difference, and it was written in the hunch of her shoulders and the fading defiance in her eyes. But he also knew better than to push. "Here," he said, reaching into his pocket. Emily tensed immediately. "I'm not taking charity," she said sharply. James chuckled softly. "It's not charity, it's an investment in an artist whose work deserves more than moldy sidewalks." He handed her a business card, crisp and simple. J. Carter Private. Collections. "If you ever want to show your portfolio somewhere that matters, call me." Emily took the card reluctantly, almost like it might burn her fingers. She looked down at it, then back up at him. "Why me?" she asked, the words cracking slightly. James met her gaze without flinching. "Because you're the first thing in a long time that's made me believe beauty can still survive in a broken world." He turned and walked away before she could reply, his figure disappearing into the misty greyness like a ghost. Emily stood there long after he was gone, the card clutched tightly in her fist. She felt something stirring deep inside her chest, something painful and exhilarating all at once, a tiny, dangerous flicker of belief. That night, curled on a cot in the corner of a crowded shelter, Emily pulled the business card from her pocket and stared at it under the flickering light. Her fingers traced the embossed letters over and over. She could still feel the warmth of the soup in her stomach, the strange weight of his words in her heart. Hope was a dangerous thing. It could lift you high enough to see the stars, or drop you from a greater height when the fall came. Emily knew that better than anyone, but as she drifted into uneasy sleep, one thought refused to let go. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way out. Maybe she hadn't reached the end yet. And maybe, just maybe, the man in the coffee shop wasn't finished with her story either. 3 days passed before Emily found the courage to even think about the card again. She spent the first day convincing herself it was a trick, the second day wondering if it mattered, and the third day realizing that survival without hope was no life at all. Sitting outside a library, chewing on a stale granola bar, she finally pulled the card from her jacket. Her thumb hovered over her cracked phone screen as she typed the number. Twice she almost deleted it. On the third attempt, before fear could win, she hit call. The line rang twice before a warm, professional voice answered. "Carter Collections, how can I help you?" Emily cleared her throat, hating how small her voice sounded. James told me to call." There was a pause. Then, "One moment, please." The line clicked and shifted, and suddenly it was him. "Emily," James said, his voice a little surprised but genuinely pleased. "I was hoping you would call." Emily bit her lip, regretting it already. I'm not looking for handouts," she blurted out. She heard him chuckle softly. "Good. I'm not offering one." "Can you meet me?" he asked. His tone wasn't commanding, just expectant, like he already knew she would say yes. Emily hesitated, glancing around the library steps like she might find an escape hatch. Finally, she sighed. "Where?" James gave her the address. Somewhere uptown, somewhere she didn't belong. She almost hung up, but instead she scribbled it down. The train ride was surreal. Emily kept expecting someone to tap her on the shoulder and drag her out of the clean, brightly lit car. She hugged her backpack tighter, ignoring the sideways glances from businesswomen and college students. She focused on the rhythm of the tracks, trying to beat back the pounding of her heart. The building was a sleek tower of glass and steel, the kind of place Emily would usually pass by without even looking up. She hesitated outside, feeling the familiar weight of shame press down on her shoulders. What was she doing here? Who was? She kidding? But before she could turn away, the revolving door spun and James stepped out. He wasn't in a suit this time. Dark jeans, a fitted sweater, a jacket slung casually over one shoulder. He smiled when he saw her, and for a moment, Emily forgot to breathe. He made the world seem less cruel. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the entrance. "I want to show you something." Against all better judgment, she followed. Inside, the lobby gleamed like something out of a dream. Marble floors, towering plants, art installations. Emily tried to make herself small, invisible. James seemed to sense it and slowed his pace slightly, matching her steps. "Don't worry," he said under his breath. "The place looks scarier than it is." She almost smiled. Almost. They took an elevator to the 15th floor. When the doors opened, Emily's breath caught. It wasn't an office. It was an art studio, wide, sun-drenched, filled with easels, canvases, brushes, colors exploding everywhere. It smelled of turpentine and possibility. For a moment she forgot her fear. She forgot everything but the aching, burning need to create. James watched her reaction closely. "This is one of our private studios," he said. "We sponsor independent artists sometimes, quietly." Emily turned to him, suspicion flickering. "Why are you showing me this?" James didn't flinch. "Because I believe in what you can do, and because I need something from you too." He crossed the room, picked up a small canvas from a nearby table, and brought it to her. It was a portrait of a boy, fragile, broken, hidden behind too many walls. "This is my nephew, Daniel," James said quietly. "He hasn't spoken since his parents died last year. Therapists haven't helped, medications haven't helped." Emily looked up sharply, heart pounding. "What does this have to do with me?" James held her gaze. "I want you to paint him, not just a picture, a portrait that might reach him, wake him up. Art can do what words can't sometimes." Emily shook her head. I'm not a miracle worker. James smiled sadly. Neither am I. But maybe together we can be close. The silence stretched long and heavy between them. Emily could hear her heartbeat in her ears. She wanted to run. She wanted to stay. She wanted to believe. She wanted to scream. James seemed to sense the battle raging inside her. He stepped back, giving her space. "Think about it," he said simply. "No pressure." He scribbled something on a slip of paper, an address, a time, and handed it to her. "If you decide to come, meet me here tomorrow." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the sunlit room, drowning in possibilities. Emily stood there long after he was gone, the slip of paper trembling in her hand. The next morning, Emily woke before dawn, heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. She lay staring at the cracked ceiling of the shelter, wrestling with herself. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, yet something about James's offer gnawed at her defenses. Not just the opportunity, it was the way he had looked at her, like she mattered. Clutching the slip of paper so tightly it crumpled, she slipped quietly from the shelter before sunrise. The city was grey and silent, a ghost town before the daily madness awoke. Emily walked the empty streets, replaying James's words over and over in her mind. "Maybe together we can be close." It sounded foolish, dangerous, and yet so desperately tempting. She found the address easily, an old stone townhouse tucked between towering modern buildings. Ivy crawled up the sides, windows framed in dark green. It looked out of place in the cold steel world around it, like a memory refusing to be erased. Emily hesitated at the gate, fighting the instinct to turn and run. Her dreams and her fears were screaming in opposite directions. Before she could lose her nerve, the front door opened. James stood there, casual but expectant, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He smiled when he saw her, genuine and unforced. "You came." Emily swallowed hard, stepping forward slowly. "I'm still deciding if that was smart." James laughed softly, stepping aside to let her in. "Smart's overrated." Inside, the townhouse felt warm, alive. Art lined the walls, some finished, some still raw and bleeding from the canvas. Sunlight pooled in patches on the creaky wooden floors. It smelled like paint and old books, and something Emily couldn't name: belonging. She shuffled awkwardly, unsure where to put herself in this world that wasn't hers. James led her to a sunroom at the back of the house. An easel stood waiting, a fresh canvas stretched tight and clean. Brushes, oils, charcoals, all neatly laid out like a feast. Emily stared at it, overwhelmed. No one had ever prepared a place for her like this. No one had ever assumed she was worth preparing for. A small cough broke the silence. Emily turned and saw him, a boy no older than 9, thin as a wisp, eyes hollow and distant. Daniel. He stood clinging to the doorframe, staring at her with a guarded expression. Emily smiled instinctively, soft and careful, but Daniel didn't react. He simply retreated a few steps, disappearing down the hallway like smoke. James sighed heavily. "That's about as much interaction as we've gotten in weeks," he admitted. Emily's heart twisted painfully. She knew that look. She knew what it was to be so trapped inside your own sadness that the world became an enemy. She turned back to the blank canvas, suddenly terrified. What if she failed? "I don't expect miracles," James said, reading her mind again. "Just try. Be yourself." Emily nodded slowly, setting her battered backpack down and pulling out her sketchbook. Her hands shook slightly as she flipped to a clean page. She wasn't sure where to begin, but beginning was better than running. Hours passed. Emily lost herself in the work, sketching quietly, letting her instincts guide her. She kept the door cracked open so Daniel could come and go without pressure. She hummed softly under her breath, a habit from the days she spent sketching her mother while she slept through illness. Little by little, she felt the tension ease. James drifted in and out, bringing her tea, adjusting the light, saying little. He didn't hover, didn't direct. He simply was. A quiet presence, steady and sure. Emily hated how comforting it felt. She hated how much she wanted to lean into it. She focused harder on her lines, her shading, her breathing. Once she caught Daniel peeking around the corner, watching her work. She pretended not to see him, her pencil moving fluidly across the page. After a moment, she heard the softest whisper. "Is that me?" It was so faint, she almost thought she imagined it. She turned, heart in her throat, but the boy was already gone. Still, she smiled to herself. It was something, a crack in the wall, a door slightly opened. She redoubled her efforts, pouring every ounce of tenderness she had into the portrait. Not perfection, emotion, not realism, recognition. She wanted Daniel to see not just what he looked like, but who he still was underneath the rubble of grief. By sunset, Emily wiped her hands on a cloth and stepped back from the easel. Her back ached, her fingers were smudged black with charcoal, and her heart felt raw. James stood behind her, silent. The portrait on the canvas wasn't flawless, but it was alive, Daniel not as he was now, but as he might be again, whole, hopeful, reaching. James let out a slow breath. "You're amazing," he said simply. Emily shook her head, unable to accept it. She wasn't amazing, she was desperate, but maybe for once desperation had built something instead of destroying it. Maybe there was still hope, for Daniel, and for herself. She packed her things, quietly, unsure whether to stay or go. James didn't pressure her, he only said, "Come back tomorrow?" His voice was soft, almost shy. Emily hesitated, then nodded once. "Okay." "Do." As she slipped out into the cool night air, the slip of paper still clutched in her hand, she realized something startling. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The next day, Emily arrived at the townhouse early, her heart hammering harder than the first time. Something about stepping inside made her feel like she was trespassing on someone else's dreams. James met her at the door, coffee in hand, smile easy. "You're early," he said, as if pleased. Emily shrugged, trying to hide how much it mattered, to be wanted somewhere. They fell into a quiet rhythm. Emily set up her materials. James retreated to another room to handle calls. Daniel hovered at the edges again, a ghost slipping between rooms. Emily pretended not to notice, even when her heart leapt at every small sign that he was watching. She sketched carefully, leaving spaces for Daniel to fill with his curiosity. Around noon, James called out from his office, "Emily, come here a second." She wiped her hands on a rag and wandered down the hall, curious. His office was a warm, book-lined sanctuary with heavy curtains and a large oak desk. James stood behind it, frowning at something on his laptop. Emily's stomach twisted instinctively at the seriousness in his tone. "I need your opinion," James said, gesturing her over. "Be honest." Emily stepped closer, nerves prickling. On the screen was a design for a new art exhibit, Emerging Voices, Artists from the Margins. At the top, the Carter Collection's logo gleamed. James glanced at her, searching her face. "What do you think?" Emily stared at it, stunned. "You're giving unknown artists a real show?" she asked cautiously. James nodded. "That's the plan. But it only works if we find artists who have something real to say, not just polished." "A gallery fluff," Emily swallowed hard. "It's incredible," she said, meaning it. James smiled, that slow, almost boyish smile that made the air feel warmer somehow. He clicked to another screen, showing a list of potential invitees. Emily scanned the names and froze. Halfway down the list, she saw it. Carter Foundation Board of Trustees, Chairman James Carter III. The blood drained from her face. 3. Not just a gallery owner, not just rich. He was the heir, one of the most powerful names in the city. James looked up just in time to see the change in her, the stiffening of her shoulders, the light draining from her eyes. "Emily?" he asked cautiously. She stepped back, instinctively, her heart hammering. "You didn't tell me," she said, voice low and shaking. James frowned. "Tell you what?" She gestured helplessly at the screen. "Who you really are." James ran a hand through his hair, frustration flashing across his face. "I didn't hide anything. You never asked." Emily let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You think I would have just walked in here if I knew you were—" "Him? The Carter dynasty? The people who turn artists into commodities?" James's face hardened slightly. "That's not what I'm trying to do." The room felt suddenly too small, the air thick with betrayal. Emily's mind raced. How stupid had she been? Trusting a man like him, letting herself believe in fairy tales? "I don't belong here," she said, backing toward the door. James took a step forward. "Emily, wait!" But she was already gone, fleeing down the hallway, through the front door, into the street. The cold hit her like a slap. Emily didn't stop running until the townhouse disappeared from view. She ducked into a side street, gasping for air, rage and shame battling for dominance inside her. How could she have been so naive? Of course kindness came with a price. Of course there were strings. There were always strings. James stood in the doorway for a long time after she disappeared, staring at the empty sidewalk. He cursed under his breath, slamming the door harder than necessary. He hadn't wanted her to find out like this. He hadn't even realized how important it was to him, until she was gone, until the house felt colder without her. Meanwhile, Emily wandered the city aimlessly, too raw to think. Her feet took her to places she barely remembered passing. The library steps, the coffee shop, the graffiti-covered alleyways. Everywhere she looked, the city seemed to mock her with its glittering promises. She was a fool to think she could belong in that world. As dusk fell, Emily curled up on a bench in a small deserted park. She pressed her forehead against her knees and fought the tears clawing at her throat. She wasn't angry at James. Not really. She was angry at herself, for wanting, for hoping, for letting herself believe she could be part of something bigger than survival. But even through the despair, a small voice whispered traitorously inside her. Maybe he wasn't lying. Maybe he saw something real in you. Emily squeezed her eyes shut. Hope was a knife, and she had forgotten how easily it cut. Night wrapped the city in a blanket of cold indifference. Emily shivered on the bench, her jacket offering little protection against the biting wind. Her hands were numb, her heart colder still. Every instinct told her to find shelter, but she couldn't move. She was stuck between anger and sorrow, between running and facing a truth she didn't want. In her pocket, the slip of paper James had given her crumpled against her fingers. She pulled it out, stared at it under the flickering streetlight. His handwriting was careful, almost vulnerable. It made her chest ache. With a bitter snort, she crumpled the paper tighter and shoved it back into her pocket. She wasn't some charity case for a Carter. The homeless shelter was full when she finally dragged herself there around midnight. She stood at the entrance for a long time, watching the line of desperate souls shuffle in and out. Every cell in her body resisted stepping back into that world. The smell of hopelessness, the fights over scraps, the endless cycle of survival without living. But she didn't have a choice. Emily wrapped her arms tighter around herself and stepped inside. The warmth was tainted with sweat and despair, but it was better than the streets. She found an empty cot against the far wall, tucked into the shadows. Curling into a tight ball, she pulled her threadbare blanket over her head and tried to disappear. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw James's face, the hurt confusion in his eyes when she fled. She cursed herself for caring. He didn't deserve her loyalty. No one did. People like him, people with power, only knew how to take. She repeated the words like a mantra, trying to kill the hope still flickering inside her. Morning came too soon, grey and miserable. Emily slipped out before the volunteers started their rounds, her body aching from the unforgiving mattress. The streets were already alive with the buzz of early workers and honking traffic. She merged into the flow like a ghost, invisible again, forgotten by a city that never missed what it never noticed. Her stomach cramped painfully by noon. She hadn't eaten since the half sandwich James had bought her. Pride battled hunger until hunger won. She slipped into a convenience store, pretending to browse until the clerk's back was turned. Then, quick as a heartbeat, she grabbed a banana and shoved it into her coat pocket. Her hand was trembling. As she approached the exit, heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear. Just as she pushed open the door, a voice barked behind her. "Hey!" Emily froze, cold sweat breaking out across her skin. She turned slowly, ready to run, ready to fight, ready for the humiliation. The clerk marched toward her, suspicion burning in his eyes, but before he could reach her, a hand appeared from nowhere, holding out a $5 bill. "I've got it," James said, calm and steady. Emily's heart plummeted into her shoes. Of all the people to see her like this, it had to be him. The clerk grunted, snatched the bill, and retreated to the counter. James turned to her, expression unreadable. Emily backed away instinctively, shame burning her cheeks. "Don't," she croaked. "Don't save me. I'm fine." James didn't move. "You're not fine," he said gently, "and you don't have to be." Tears blurred her vision. She hated him for being kind, hated herself more for wanting to believe him. "You lied," she whispered. James shook his head. "I didn't. I just didn't tell you everything. I wanted you to see me before you saw my name." His voice cracked slightly. "I wanted you to see me." Emily wiped her sleeve roughly across her face. "It doesn't matter. People like you don't belong with people like me." She turned and ran before he could answer, the banana still clutched in her pocket. Like a stupid, humiliating prize. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs buckled. She collapsed in a narrow alley between two shuttered shops, pressing her forehead against the damp brick. What was she doing? She couldn't go back. She couldn't move forward. She was trapped, running nowhere, burning bridges faster than she could build them. The city loomed above her, cold and uncaring. And yet, somewhere deep inside the ruins of her hope, a stubborn ember still refused to die. James had seen her at her worst, and he hadn't turned away. He hadn't pitied her. He had simply stayed. She hated that it mattered. She hated that it meant everything. In the stillness of the alley, with the world moving indifferently around her, Emily realized something brutal and terrifying. Maybe it wasn't James she didn't trust. Maybe it was herself. The cold sank into Emily's bones as she sat in the alley, unmoving. Hours passed unnoticed, time slipping through her fingers like water. She hugged her knees tighter, rocking slightly. Memories she had buried deep clawed their way to the surface. Ghosts of a life she had once believed was normal, before everything had shattered beyond repair. She had grown up in a cramped apartment 2 neighborhoods over, the daughter of a man who could sell charm by the pound and a mother who believed in fairy tales. Her father, Harold Dawson, was a small-time hustler dressed in ambition he couldn't afford. He sold dreams to desperate people, and when those dreams collapsed, he always found someone else to blame. When Emily was 16, the blame had landed squarely on her. Harold had roped her into a business deal, promising it was harmless. Just sign a few papers, help him out, he said. She trusted him. She didn't realize she was signing false documents, tying herself to debts that weren't hers. When it all fell apart, Harold disappeared, leaving her to face the storm. Eviction came first, then the repossession notices, then the shame. Her mother, fragile and sickly, crumbled under the weight. of it all. She died less than a year later, lungs failing from years of unfulfilled dreams and second-hand sorrow. Emily was left with nothing but a suitcase full of sketches and a heart full of bruises. She had tried to build something out of the ruins. She found part-time jobs, cleaned houses, sold sketches on street corners. But the city didn't have patience for broken things. Every door slammed in her face carved another scar. Every rejection whispered the same brutal truth. You don't belong here anymore. Emily wiped her face roughly with the sleeve of her jacket, forcing the memories back into their cages. They didn't help. They never did. She needed to move, needed to breathe. She staggered to her feet, her joints aching from cold and stillness, and stumbled back onto the main street. Her steps were aimless. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay where she was. Somewhere, deep down, a desperate, shameful thought pulsed. What if James was right? What if there was still a way to build something new? The thought was as terrifying as it was tempting. Emily wandered past luxury storefronts glittering with things she would never touch. Past restaurants where a single meal cost more than she made in a week. She pressed herself against the shadows, unseen and unwanted, a ghost drifting through a world that no longer made space for her. Her reflection in the glass windows looked like a stranger. When she finally stopped walking, she realized her feet had taken her back to Bean and Bloom, the little cafe where it had all started. She hesitated outside, her hand hovering over the door. She was too proud to go inside, too broken to pretend. But standing there in the drizzle, she felt like she was teetering on the edge of a decision that mattered. Through the window, she could see people laughing, sipping coffee, living lives untouched by her kind of wreckage. She could almost hear her father's voice sneering in her head. They'll never let you in. You're not one of them. Emily gritted her teeth against the old, poisonous echoes. She wasn't her father. She wasn't her past. Without thinking, she turned and headed for the library instead, the one safe place left where no one asked questions if you stayed too long. She slipped through the heavy wooden doors and let the silence fold around her like a balm. She found a quiet corner and sank into an armchair, burying her face in her hands. Minutes stretched into hours. She didn't read. She didn't draw. She just breathed, slowly, painfully, as if teaching her body how to exist again. Somewhere nearby, a child's giggle pierced the stillness, and Emily's heart twisted. Daniel's face flashed in her mind. Fragile, hopeful, waiting for someone to reach him. She pulled the crumpled slip of paper from her pocket again, smoothing it carefully against her thigh. James's address, his offer, his belief. She hated how much it mattered to her, hated how much she wanted to believe he had meant it, but most of all, she hated the fear whispering that she wasn't worth saving. The sun was setting by the time she made her decision. It wasn't courage exactly that moved her. It was something grittier, more stubborn. Survival had taught her to expect nothing, but hope, foolish, reckless hope, taught her that maybe it was okay to try anyway. Even if it hurt, even if it broke her again. Emily stood, tucking the slip of paper into her jacket with trembling fingers. For better or worse, she knew where she needed to go. And this time, she wasn't running from it. She was running toward it. The townhouse loomed in the twilight like a beacon and a warning. Emily stood across the street, heart hammering in her chest, staring up at the windows lit with a soft, golden glow. Every instinct screamed for her to turn around, to disappear. Back into the darkness she knew so well, but her feet stayed rooted to the sidewalk. The weight of the crumpled paper in her pocket was a brand against her skin. She crossed the street slowly, each step heavier than the last. When she reached the door, her hand hesitated over the buzzer. She could still walk away, pretend none of this had happened, stay safe inside the cocoon of her own loneliness. Before she could second-guess herself again, the door swung open. James stood there, as if he had been waiting. His face was unreadable, cautious, hopeful, wounded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them was vast, a canyon, carved by pride and fear and all the things they hadn't said. Emily forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm not here for pity," she said quietly. James nodded. "Good, I'm not offering any." His voice was steady, but there was a crack under the surface. He stepped aside, and Emily entered, the warmth of the house wrapping around her like a tentative embrace. They moved to the sunroom, without speaking. The unfinished portrait still stood on the easel, waiting patiently. Daniel was nowhere in sight. Emily's eyes flicked to the window, the empty doorway, the corners of the room. She felt his absence like a missing note in a familiar song. James finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said simply. No grand speeches, no excuses. Just 2 words, raw and real. Emily swallowed hard, the knot in her throat too tight to speak around. She didn't know if it was enough, but she knew it was more than most people ever gave. "I shouldn't have hidden who I was," James continued, his voice low. I didn't want you to see the name first. I wanted you to see me." Emily shook her head, hugging herself tightly. "It's not just the name, James. It's everything that comes with it. Power, money, expectations. It changes things." James stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "It doesn't have to change us," he said, "if you don't want it to." Emily let out a shaky breath, torn between hope and fear. She had spent so long surviving alone, she didn't know how to let someone stand beside her without losing herself. "I don't want to be another charity project," she whispered. James's eyes darkened. "You're not." His voice was fierce, almost angry, not at her, but at the world that had made her doubt her own worth. "You're not broken. You're not a burden. You're the strongest damn person I've ever met." The words hit harder than a slap. Emily turned away, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. She didn't know how to carry kindness without breaking under its weight, didn't know how to believe in something that didn't demand a debt she couldn't pay. It was easier to push it away. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. James was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Then don't do anything. Just stay, paint, exist. No contracts, no expectations." Emily turned back toward him, searching his face for the lie. She didn't find one. "One day at a time," James said, "or 1 hour, whatever you need." Emily's hands trembled slightly at her sides. She wanted so badly to believe him, to step into this fragile thing between them without smashing it under the weight of her fear. She took a slow, shaky breath. "Okay," she said finally, her voice cracking. James smiled, relief softening the edges of his tension. He didn't move to hug her or touch her. He just smiled, and in that moment, it felt like enough. Emily stepped toward the easel, her hands steadying as they reached for the brushes, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, pride didn't have to be armor. It could be something else, something softer, something that didn't hurt so much to carry. The next few days passed in a fragile, tentative rhythm. Emily returned to the townhouse each morning, heart hammering, until she stepped through the door and found James there, steady as ever. They spoke little at first, sharing small nods, quiet smiles, and moments that didn't need words. It was a new kind of survival, one rooted in trust instead of fear. Daniel remained elusive. Sometimes he hovered near the doorway, silent and watchful. Sometimes he disappeared for hours, lost in his own shadows. Emily never pushed. She simply painted. Sometimes she hummed under her breath, soft and low, filling the silence with something that wasn't heavy or demanding. Slowly the walls began to thin. On the 4th morning, James didn't greet her at the door. Instead, a stranger did, a woman with fiery red hair and a sharp, assessing gaze. She wore a leather jacket and sneakers that looked expensive and battered at the same time. Her smile was quick, mischievous, and just a little dangerous. "You must be Emily," she said, sticking out her hand. Caught off guard, Emily shook it warily. Yeah, and you are?" The woman grinned. "Sophie, James's best friend, and depending on the day, his designated reality check." Emily relaxed a fraction. There was something disarming about Sophie, an energy that didn't leave room for lies or fake smiles. Emily liked her immediately. Sophie led the way into the kitchen, where the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. "James had a meeting," she explained, pouring 2 mugs without asking. "He told me to keep an eye on you." She winked. "But don't worry, I'm terrible at surveillance. Mostly I'm here for the gossip." Emily laughed despite herself, tension easing from her shoulders. They sat at the kitchen island, sipping coffee, like old friends. Sophie asked questions, real ones, not the kind designed to judge or pity, but the kind that said, "I want to understand you." Emily found herself talking more than she intended, sharing scraps of her past, her art, her failures, and the fragile thread that had led her here. When she faltered, unsure how much to reveal, Sophie shrugged and said, "Everyone's a mess, Emily. Some of us just hide it better." Emily smiled, feeling a strange, unfamiliar warmth bloom in her chest. Maybe she didn't have to carry the weight of her past alone. Maybe it didn't have to define her forever. As they talked, Daniel crept into the room, barefoot and silent. He paused when he saw Sophie, eyes wary. Sophie didn't blink. She slid off her stool, knelt to his level and said, "Hey, bud, cool shirt." Daniel glanced down at his faded dinosaur T-shirt, then back at her. A tiny, uncertain smile tugged at his lips. Emily watched, amazed. Sophie had cracked something in 30 seconds that therapists hadn't touched in months. She was a force of nature, unapologetic, genuine, fearless, and somehow she made the heavy air in the house lighter just by existing. Emily wondered what it would be like to move through the world that freely. Later, after Daniel retreated and the dishes were cleared, Sophie turned serious. "Listen," she said, tapping her fingers against her coffee cup. "I know it's scary letting someone like James in, trusting a guy with that much baggage and money and good intentions." Emily stiffened, but Sophie held up a hand. "But you should know something," she continued, voice softening. "James doesn't let people in easily. Hell, he barely lets me in. If he's making space for you, it's because he sees something real, something he needs, not something he's trying to fix." Emily swallowed hard, her chest tightening around something tender and painful. "You're not a project, Emily," Sophie said. "You're the missing piece." The words hit harder than Emily expected. She looked down at her hands, rough and paint-stained, and wondered how anyone could see something worth keeping in them. Before Emily could respond, the front door creaked open, and James's voice echoed through the hall. "I'm back." Sophie grinned, grabbing her jacket. "That's my cue. Try not to break him while I'm gone." She tossed Emily a wink and slipped out, leaving behind a kitchen full of unfinished conversations and fragile, blooming hope. James stepped into the room, his smile faltering when he saw the complicated emotions chasing across Emily's face. "Everything okay?" he asked carefully. Emily looked at him, really looked, and saw not a billionaire, not a savior, but a man trying, scared, stubborn, real. For the first time, she didn't feel like running. The days that followed felt different. Not easy, not perfect, but different. Emily woke each morning with a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, purpose. She arrived at the townhouse to find James already there, coffee ready, a quiet smile waiting. Daniel would peek out from behind doors, inching closer, trusting, more. Emily threw herself into the portrait, pouring every ounce of her heart into it. She captured not just Daniel's features, but his spirit, the boy he might still become if someone loved him hard enough. Each brushstroke was a prayer, a promise, a rebellion against the darkness that had nearly swallowed her too. One afternoon, while adjusting the light, Emily caught James watching her. He didn't look away when she met his gaze. There was no awkwardness, no pretending, just quiet admiration, as if seeing her doing what she loved was enough to anchor him. Emily blushed, turning back to her work, but the warmth lingered. James started staying longer in the sunroom, pretending to read emails, but mostly just being there. He asked questions about her process, her inspiration, her dreams. Emily answered cautiously at first, then with more openness. He listened the way few people ever had, not to reply, not to fix, but simply to understand. Slowly, a strange kind of life bloomed around them. Breakfasts turned into conversations, afternoons blurred into music and laughter. Daniel started leaving crayon drawings for Emily to find, small, clumsy pictures of spaceships and dragons, and houses with 3 figures inside, always 3, always together. One evening, after Daniel fell asleep, sprawled across the sunroom rug, Emily and James sat in the kitchen, sharing a bottle of cheap wine Sophie had smuggled in. The laughter faded into a comfortable silence, heavy with things neither dared to say out loud. James traced the rim of his glass thoughtfully. "Do you ever think," he said finally, voice low, "that some people are meant to find each other, even if everything tries to keep them apart?" Emily's heart thudded painfully. She didn't know how to answer without unraveling everything she was trying to protect inside herself. So she said nothing, and James didn't push. Instead, he just smiled, a small, secret smile, and poured her another glass. Maybe some questions didn't need answers yet. Maybe just asking them was enough for now, but not everything was easy. Emily still flinched when rich clients visited the house, their polite disdain barely masked. She still battled the instinct to run every time she caught someone whispering about her second-hand clothes or rough hands. She still struggled to believe she belonged anywhere. James noticed, of course. He always noticed. One afternoon, after a particularly tense encounter with a snooty art dealer, he found her hiding on the back porch, knees pulled to her chest. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside her, close but not touching, waiting. "You don't have to change who you are," James said quietly. "Not for them, not for me, not for anyone." Emily blinked back tears, fighting the urge to believe him. Words were easy, promises were cheap, but James didn't just say them, he stayed to prove them. Slowly, Emily started reclaiming pieces of herself she thought were lost. She began sketching again, not just for survival, but for joy. She filled notebook after notebook with messy, beautiful dreams. Some nights, she even let herself imagine a future that didn't end in running or hunger, but deep inside, fear still gnawed at her. Fear that it was all temporary, that one day the door would close and she would be back on the street, forgotten. Fear that she wasn't enough for this new life she was daring to taste. It was easier to live in fear than to admit how much she wanted to stay. Late one night, while cleaning her brushes, Emily caught her reflection in the sunroom window. For the first time, she didn't see a ghost. She saw a fighter. She saw someone who had bled for every scrap of hope and was still standing. She saw someone worthy of love, even if she didn't quite believe it yet. She smiled to herself, small, shaky, but real, and turned off the lights. Upstairs, Daniel slept peacefully. James worked quietly in his office, and the house, once full of silence and grief, breathed with new life. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't certain, but it was theirs, and maybe, just maybe, it was enough. Emily was beginning to believe she might outrun her past when it came crashing back into her life. It started with a phone call James received one rainy afternoon, his face darkening as he listened. He ended the call quickly, but the tension in his shoulders gave him away. Emily watched him carefully, heart already sinking. "Is everything okay?" she asked, setting down her brush. James hesitated, then nodded too quickly. "Just business." But Emily knew better. She felt it in her bones, the old familiar chill that warned when storms were brewing. She didn't push. She didn't have to. The truth had a way of surfacing whether you were ready or not. 2 days later, it found her. She was walking home from the townhouse when she spotted him leaning against a lamppost, smoking a cigarette with practiced arrogance. Harold Dawson, her father, alive, smirking, as if he hadn't abandoned her to rot years ago. Emily's blood froze in her veins. "Hey, kid," he drawled, flicking ashes onto the sidewalk. "Looking fancy these days?" Emily stood frozen, rage and fear battling inside her. She thought she would never see him again, hoped she wouldn't. Yet here he was, dragging the worst parts of her life back into the light. "What do you want?" she spat, her voice shaking with fury. Harold grinned, all yellow teeth and bad intentions. "Just came to congratulate my little girl. Heard you finally hooked yourself a golden goose." His voice oozed mockery, and Emily's stomach twisted violently. He knew about James, about the townhouse, about everything. "Stay away from me," she hissed, backing away. Harold took a step forward, blocking her path. Now," he said, voice syrupy. "No need to be rude. I'm just saying, it'd be a shame if someone started spreading stories about who you really are, where you came from." Emily's heart hammered painfully against her ribs. He was threatening her, threatening to destroy everything she was building with lies and half-truths. She couldn't let James get caught in her mess, couldn't let Daniel be dragged into it. She had to protect them, even if it meant sacrificing herself again. "What do you want?" she whispered, dreading the answer. Harold smiled like a man who had just won a rigged game. "Simple, a little cash. You're living high now, right? Shouldn't be a problem otherwise." He let the threat dangle, cruel and heavy in the damp evening air. Emily stared at him, fists clenching at her sides. She had nothing, no savings, no resources, only James's fragile trust. And now, even that was a weapon Harold could twist against her. She turned and fled, the sound of his laughter chasing her down the street like a pack of wolves. She didn't stop running until she reached the townhouse. She burst through the door, chest heaving, hands shaking. James appeared instantly, his face creasing with concern. "Emily, what happened?" She couldn't speak, couldn't explain. She shook her head violently, backing away from him, from the warmth and safety he offered. "I have to go," she gasped. "I can't stay here." James caught her arms gently, grounding her. "Talk to me," he urged. "Please." Emily squeezed her eyes shut. If she told him, she would drag him into her mess. If she didn't, she would lose everything anyway. Either way, the past was tearing her life apart again. She broke free and bolted upstairs, locking herself in the guest room. She pressed her forehead against the door, trembling. She could hear James calling her name softly from the hallway, but she couldn't answer, couldn't risk it. She was poison, and she wouldn't destroy the only good thing left in her life. Alone in the dark, Emily cried silently, letting the old wounds bleed fresh. Hope had been a mistake. Believing she could escape had been a fantasy. The city outside the window glittered with promises it would never keep, and somewhere in the distance, she could still hear Harold's mocking laugh. Tomorrow she would have to choose, fight for the life she was building, or run before it crumbled under her feet. Either way, the ghosts weren't finished with her yet. James barely slept that night. He sat outside Emily's locked door, head resting against the wall, listening to the occasional sounds of her restless movements. He didn't know what had driven her into such terror, but he knew better than to push. Trust wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned, piece by fragile piece. At dawn, she emerged, eyes red, shoulders slumped. She didn't speak, just nodded once, like a soldier acknowledging the inevitable battle ahead. James stood, his heart breaking a little at the sight. "I'm not going anywhere," he said simply. Emily gave a weak, almost imperceptible nod, but the walls around her stayed high. After she left, James made a decision. He wouldn't wait for her to bring him the truth. He would find it himself. He needed to understand what demons haunted her steps, so he made some calls. Quiet ones, discreet. He had resources, connections, and this time he wasn't afraid to use them. By evening, the pieces had begun to fall into place. Harold Dawson, a name stained with fraud charges, unpaid debts, scams that had bled dozens of people dry, and Emily, caught in the wreckage, barely an adult when it all came crashing down. Signed papers, false witnesses, ruined credit. No wonder she ran. James stared at the reports spread across his desk, fury simmering under his skin. She wasn't a grifter. She wasn't a gold digger. She was a survivor, someone who had been betrayed by the very people who should have protected her. He felt sick, imagining how alone she must have felt all these years. He thought of her laugh, cautious but beautiful, of the way her fingers trembled slightly when she sketched, as if every line cost her a piece of her soul. He thought of Daniel's shy smiles, the way the boy came alive when Emily was near. James realized with a painful clarity that he couldn't let her go. Meanwhile, Emily wandered the city, trapped in a storm of panic and shame. Harold's threats hung over her like a guillotine. She couldn't bring that kind of danger into James's life, into Daniel's life. She thought about running again, changing her name, disappearing into another forgotten corner of the world. But then she thought of Daniel's crayon drawings, the house with 3 figures, always 3, always together. She thought of James, standing steady even when she tried to push him away. She thought of Sophie's fierce grin and quiet faith. And for the first time, she realized maybe running wasn't the answer anymore. Maybe it never had been. That night, standing under the broken neon sign of a closed diner, Emily made a choice. She wasn't going to let Harold win. She wasn't going to let her past steal her future, even if it terrified her, even if it meant trusting people when every scar screamed not to. She headed back to the townhouse, heart hammering harder with each step. She half expected the door to be locked, the windows dark, the life she had started to build already gone. But when she pushed open the door, James was there, waiting, just like he said he would be. Their eyes met across the room. No words, no speeches, just raw, painful honesty. Emily stepped forward, fists clenched to keep herself from shaking. "I need to tell you everything," she said, voice rough. James nodded once, "And I'm ready to hear it." They sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Emily had once sipped coffee like a stranger. Now it felt different. It felt like home. She told him everything, the scams, the betrayal, the years of surviving in shadows. Her voice shook, cracked, but never broke. James listened, silent, fierce, unflinching. When she finished, she braced herself for the inevitable rejection, the disgust, the distance. But James only reached across the table and took her hand in, his steady and warm. "None of that changes who you are," he said. "It just makes me admire you more." Emily's breath hitched painfully. Hope wasn't a knife tonight. It wasn't a weakness. It was a lifeline. She squeezed his hand, anchoring herself to it, and for the first time allowed herself to believe that maybe she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Maybe she never had to again. The day of the exhibition dawned cold and bright, the city buzzing with electric anticipation. Inside the Carter Collections Gallery, final preparations buzzed like a hive of anxious bees. Paintings were adjusted, lights recalibrated, glasses polished. But one section remained hidden under a velvet drape, James's personal project, his tribute to the truth Emily had tried so hard to bury. Emily paced behind the scenes, nerves fraying at the edges. She wore a simple black dress borrowed from Sophie, her hair pinned loosely. She felt like an imposter among the polished socialites and critics who would soon flood the halls. James found her minutes before the doors opened, his tie crooked, his grin reassuring. "You're going to be amazing," he said, adjusting the strap of her bag where it had slipped off her shoulder. Emily smiled weakly, her stomach a knot of dread and hope. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe she deserved to stand among the people who had been born into this world of light and color. The gallery filled quickly. Laughter echoed off marble floors. Cameras flashed. The smell of champagne and expensive perfume filled the air. Emily stuck close to James, her anchor in a sea of sharp smiles and sharper judgments. Sophie joined them, looping an arm through Emily's and murmuring snarky commentary that made her want to laugh and cry at once. Midway through the night, James stepped onto the small platform at the center of the gallery, microphone in hand. The crowd quieted, attention shifting. Emily's heart thudded painfully. She didn't know what he was planning. He had kept the final details secret, insisting she trust him. Trust, the hardest thing, the most necessary thing. James cleared his throat, scanning the faces before him. "Tonight," he began, voice steady, "we celebrate not just art, but resilience, courage, the stories hidden behind every brushstroke and line." He gestured toward the draped installation behind him. "Some of the most beautiful art is born from the deepest struggles." With a nod to the staff, the velvet covering was whisked away. Gasps rippled through the room. Emily's breath caught painfully. On the wall hung her portrait of Daniel, vivid, raw, heartbreakingly real. Beside it, a plaque, not with her full name, not with her past laid bare. Just a simple inscription: "Emerging voices, hope in unexpected places." James continued speaking, his voice thick with emotion. "This artist has faced more in a few years than most of us will in a lifetime. Betrayal, loss, homelessness. And yet, she continues to create beauty where others would see only ruin. She reminds us that no past defines us, only what we choose to build from it." Tears blurred Emily's vision. Around her, the crowd murmured, intrigued, moved. Some faces held awe, some held skepticism, but none held the cold dismissal she had feared. For the first time, she wasn't invisible, she wasn't a mistake, she was a force, a voice they couldn't ignore. Sophie squeezed her hand hard, grinning fiercely. James stepped down from the platform, weaving through the crowd until he reached her. He didn't say anything, he didn't have to. His eyes said it all. "I see you, I believe in you, I'm with you." Emily felt something inside her click into place, something that had been broken for too long. As the night wore on, strangers approached her, curators, journalists, even other artists, offering handshakes, compliments, invitations. Emily accepted them cautiously, learning to stand a little taller with each one. She wasn't pretending anymore. She wasn't running anymore. She was living her truth, standing under the lights without flinching. Later, while helping Sophie box up leftover programs, Emily caught sight of Harold lurking near the entrance. His mouth twisted in a sneer when their eyes met. But Emily didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She stood her ground, chin high, heart steady. Harold took a step forward and found James already there, blocking his path. "Not tonight," James said coldly, his voice a steel blade wrapped in velvet. "Not ever again." Harold hesitated, reading the unyielding threat in James's stance. For once, he knew he was outmatched. With a scowl, he turned and disappeared into the night. Emily watched him go, feeling lighter than she had in years. She turned back to James, her chest aching with gratitude, and something deeper, something terrifying in its depth. Love, pure and simple and terrifying. James caught her gaze, and for a moment the whole crowded gallery faded away. There was only him, only her, only the fragile, fierce miracle they had built together. The night ended with laughter and clinking glasses and promises of new beginnings. Emily stood under the lights, surrounded by art and possibility, and finally let herself believe it was real. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. The gallery emptied slowly, leaving behind echoes of laughter and the lingering smell of champagne. Emily stood alone in the center of the room, staring at her portrait of Daniel. The boy's eyes seemed to shimmer under the soft lights, full of a hope she had barely dared to believe existed. It wasn't just his portrait anymore. It was hers too. James approached quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, sharing the silence. Emily glanced at him, her chest tight with emotions too big to name. Gratitude, fear, joy, love, all tangled together in a knot she didn't know how to untie. "You did it," James said finally, his voice soft with wonder. Emily shook her head, tears pricking her eyes. "We did it." She looked back at the portrait, blinking fast. I never thought I'd find a place where I could just be me." James smiled, the kind of smile that stripped away every doubt. "You didn't find it," he said, "you built it." Emily laughed through her tears, the sound light and fragile. "I had a little help." James bumped her shoulder gently. "We all need a little help sometimes." His voice dropped, the teasing replaced by something deeper, something trembling at the edges of control. "I need you, Emily." The words hit her harder than any applause, any gallery opening, any praise. She turned to him fully, heart pounding so loudly she thought the whole city could hear. "I need you too," she whispered, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. James reached for her, tentative, almost reverent. Their kiss was slow, soft, devastating in its gentleness. It wasn't desperate or wild. It was a promise, a bridge built over every broken place in both of them. Emily clung to him, feeling the warmth of his hands, the steady beat of his heart against hers. She wasn't falling this time. She was flying. When they pulled apart, James rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed. "Stay," he whispered. "Not just tonight, not just for the gallery. Stay with me. Build something with me." Emily closed, her eyes too, letting the words wash over her like sunlight. She had spent so long running, surviving, hiding. Now, maybe it was time to live. She nodded against his forehead, too overwhelmed to speak. James let out a shaky breath of relief, pulling her closer. Around them the gallery lights dimmed, the city outside humming with endless, beautiful noise. But inside, it was just the two of them, standing at the beginning of something terrifying and wonderful. Months later, Emily would stand at another gallery opening, holding Daniel's hand while he tugged impatiently at his tie. James would be beside her, his arm looped casually around her waist, his eyes always finding hers across crowded rooms. Their world wasn't perfect. Some days were hard, some nights were long, but it was real. It was theirs. Emily would still wake sometimes, heart pounding, expecting the dream to end, expecting the cold to seep back in. But then she would feel James's hand curl around hers, steady and certain. She would hear Daniel's soft laughter in the next room. She would smell paint and coffee and hope. And she would remember she was no longer a ghost. She was home, not because of the walls around her, not because of the name she carried now, but because she had finally learned that home isn't a place. It's the people who refuse to let you fall. It's the ones who see you, broken, bruised, brilliant, and choose you anyway. And for the first time in her life, Emily Dawson was exactly where she was meant to be. Wow, what a story, right? I'd love to hear what you thought. Drop a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tell me where you're watching from. And hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out the other stories we have on the channel. There's so much more waiting for you.